Madam Speaker, in November last year, Parliament debated the Constitution Amendment Bill, which provided for the Presidency to continue to be an elected office and for presidential elections to be reserved for ethnic communities. The Workers' Party rejects both these concepts and thus opposed the bill then. As this bill today seeks to entrench these further, we oppose this bill. Lest we be misunderstood or misconstrued, I should state once again that we wish to see multiracial representation in the office of our head of state. However, such multiracial representation should be achieved not by way of reserved elections, but by the former system of appointing presidents. We have canvassed our arguments during the debate on the Constitution amendments, and we do not intend to rehash them today. Let me move specifically to two aspects of this bill which are very problematic. First, how to count reserved elections, and secondly, the eligibility criteria for candidates from the private sector. First, how to count reserved elections. Clause 3 introduces a new Section 5A that, to determine whether an election is reserved under Article 19B of the Constitution, one has to refer to the new schedule. The schedule sets out a table showing President Wee Kim Wee as the first president to be counted. Together with the subsequent presidential terms of President Ong Teng Cheong, 2 terms of President S.R. Nathan, and 1 term of President Tony Tan, these form 5 terms where a non-Malay president was in office. Thus, the government reaches the conclusion that this year's presidential election will be reserved for Malays. Madam, this is a conclusion that has left Singaporeans bewildered and suspicious. To recap, during the November debate, the Prime Minister told the House for the first time that the government had received advice from the Attorney General's chambers on how to apply the hiatus-triggered mechanism for reserve elections, that is, which president's term to count from. We were told that the advice was that counting should begin from President Wee Kim Wee, who was then the first president to exercise the powers of an elected president. This advice was surprising and illogical to many Singaporeans, given that President Wee Kim Wee was never elected to office. When I asked Deputy Prime Minister Teo Chee Hean then whether the government would publish the AGC's advice for Singaporeans to better understand the reasoning, the government appeared reluctant to do so, and even asked me whether I was suggesting that the Prime Minister was not being truthful. There has been a lot of public reaction to the announcement that this year's presidential election would be reserved for Malay candidates. After the last presidential election 6 years ago, Singaporeans are right to be skeptical about the government's motives now. In 2011, Dr. Tony Tan was the government's preferred choice, but had to fight off 3 other candidates, scraping through to victory with a mere 35.2% of the popular vote and a razor-thin margin of 0.35%. For the next presidential election, we hear a sudden announcement by the government that it would be reserved for Malay candidates based on reasoning which is totally unconvincing. How many people really believe that the presidential election this year is reserved for Malays to ensure minority representation? And why now? Madam, 3 months have passed since that debate. I had been reflecting on the decision to use President Wee as a reference point. I realized that this decision to come from President Wee was not a matter of getting legal advice to interpret any existing laws. If one looks at this bill and the schedule, the government is asking Parliament to simply make it the law that President Wee is the first one to be counted. Why not count from the first elected president, Mr. Ong Teng Cheong? Is it because if President Ong was the first one to be counted, we would have to go through this year's elections as an open election and risk a contest by Chinese or Indian candidates who may not be to the government's liking? Isn't the decision to count from President Wee an arbitrary and deliberate decision of the government to achieve a desired outcome? Next, eligibility criteria for private sector candidates. Clause 3 also introduces a new Section 5C, which deals with the eligibility criteria for presidential candidates from the private sector. Section 5C touches on the definitions of shareholders' equity, profit after tax, and insolvency events. These definitions are needed due to the new requirement for candidates to have run companies of shareholders' equity of at least $500 million which have been profitable.